Excellent.
There we go. All right, and am I the co-host here, Mike, so I can screen share?
You will be in just one quick moment.
Okay. Well, good evening and welcome everyone to the Tuesday, November 30th, 2021 workshop, Select Board workshop on short-term rentals, or STRs as they are called in certain circles. I think, let's see, we have Blake is here, Sally is here, Frank, Courtney, and Shiloh's here, Lisa's here. We also are joined by Mike Pardue, Natalie Burns, Karen Witten, and last, but of course not least, Chris Osterreiter, who's got one eye on the ice rink, right? All right, and let's see, who do we have in the, who are joining us as attendees. There we go. All right, so I'm going to start the evening with a little overview of what it is that I think we're trying to accomplish here, but that certainly doesn't mean that that's what everyone needs to think or feel. We have promised to get Natalie out of the meeting in an hour or less, hopefully less, because her husband is celebrating a huge natal anniversary. Is that right, Natalie?
I don't think he would like it to be referred to as a huge one, Blake, but yes.
Does it have a 0 on the end?
It does indeed.
Yes, I just went through one of those myself. All right, so I'm gonna screen share here, and I've got a very short PowerPoint. There it is. Where is it? Is that it? Yeah, it is. So I'm going to play it from the start. This is very short and hopefully will help us get all together on the same page. I just went out and quickly put this together based on some research that I did last year and updated it for this year. So there you go. What is a short-term rental? That's going to become a very important question to answer should we ever undertake to regulate short-term rentals, but more on that from Natalie in a moment. Obviously, it's a short-term rental is a furnished living space that can go from weeks to days to years on end. You'll note that the IRS has rules for 7, 15, and 30-day occupancy. Ultra short-term rentals, that's kind of a new term. Ultra short-term rentals are defined as 4 days or less, and those are the ones that seem to have proliferated over time. And of course, what we always need to keep in mind here is the contrast between these short-term rentals and long-term or seasonal rentals, which have always been a part of our community. So I've tried to list the pros and cons based on what I found online. I'm not trying to tip the scale in any direction. I'm just, like I said, trying to set the table for hopefully a fruitful discussion on the subject. So the pros for short-term rentals include the fact that sharing living space has been a traditional activity as long as there have been spare rooms and comfortable couches. I mean, you'll remember that Forrest Gump's mother ran a boarding house, and you know, there were always rooms for rent above stores, and this has been a part of our civic fabric for centuries, and so this is nothing new. This has been going on for quite some time, and that is something we should bear in mind. Arguably, basic property rights permit short-term rental. That's an argument that some people would make. I'm sure we'll hear from Natalie on that subject. Short-term rentals help property owners pay their bills, and that's what we're going to hear a lot from our residents, that they look to this income as a way of making ends meet, especially in their golden years. It gives consumers more options in terms of where they can stay when they visit. It increases room inventory for our tourist trade, which is important. And if we have more tourists, then theoretically, we have more people spending money at local businesses, which I think we all would agree is a good thing. Some of the cons, there's the possibility of transforming peaceful communities into communities of transients. And that's one of the big concerns here, is that it tears at the fabric of our community to the extent that we have absentee ownership of what used to be neighborhood houses that have no connection. The owners have no connection to our community, something that we probably ought to think about as we talk about this. Short-term renters probably don't know or fail to follow local rules, and that can lead to safety risks, noise issues, and trash and parking problems for local neighbors, and that's not a good thing. We're all familiar with the fact that there are so-called party houses, which can severely impact neighbors and ultimately result in a decline in home values. And I think there's one house listed on Airbnb, I believe, that has 16 beds in our community, which is almost incomprehensible, but there it is. Conversion of residential units can lead to fewer affordable housing and higher rents. I left out "and" there, but that's always a concern that we've had, is affordable housing. I know that's high on the list of things that Courtney always brings up, and it can also result in higher rents as local residents who need to rent compete with people who are coming in from away to visit. It might result in the reduced demand for local bed and breakfasts, hotels and motels, and it's certainly not a level playing field when you consider that local B&Bs, hotels and motels have to go through quite rigorous inspection and regulatory oversight just to get open. Service jobs may be jeopardized to the extent that these Airbnbs disrupt the bed and breakfasts, hotels and motels. We may miss out on some tax revenue, more on that later, I'm sure. And the other thing is that what we really, I think, are concerned about here is the possibility of tension and hostility between short-term residents and or landlords and the neighbors that abut them. And so that is probably one of the main reasons why we're having that conversation this evening. And then finally, if we do nothing, which is certainly a possibility, we may decide that there's no problem here. It may, in fact, lead to people losing confidence in us and being disillusioned that we're not interested in their quality of life. And so we need to bear that in mind as elected representatives. Issues to consider, we're going to start with Natalie. She's going to go over legal and other regulatory issues. And in a minute, Natalie, I'll pull up your outline that you gave Mike. We're going to look at this current status quo in our community, including the number of units or number of units that Chris and Karen have looked into. And then we're going to have a discussion with the board and the public. And the questions we always like to ask in these sessions: what is the problem? Is it really a problem? Is it our problem to solve? And if it's a real problem and ours to solve, how do we proceed? And I think the goal here is to make short-term rentals work for everyone. That means people that have a vested interest in these rental properties and their neighbors and all of our residents in this community. So without further ado, does anybody want to object to anything that I put up there or add or subtract? Okay, without further ado, Natalie, I'm going to bring up your outline and let you do your thing. Whoops. Try not to leave the meeting here. And Natalie, that's your outline. So you have the con.
It is. Thank you, Blake. For those of you who were on the board back in September of 2020, this outline will look very familiar to you. This is the one that Sally Daggett presented to you. Sally Daggett, for those of you who weren't there, is my partner, and she is the city attorney in South Portland, which I think you all know has had a lot of experience with regulation of short-term rentals, and particularly has been kind of a leader in some of the stricter types of regulations that even Portland has not adopted yet. Some other municipalities are starting to follow some of the things that South Portland has done, including Cape Elizabeth has made a dramatic change to its regulation of short-term rentals. Cape Elizabeth was actually one of the first towns in southern Maine to have a short-term rental regulation, but it was part of its land use ordinance, and it didn't have a lot of meat on the bones, but it did have a regulation, and it did allow it as a use with some restrictions. So when we start talking about short-term rentals, I will tell you most of the ordinances that you see do define it as rentals of less than 30 days. If you start going over 30 days, you're talking about actual tenants who are protected under state law, under landlord-tenant law. But under that, those protections don't necessarily apply. And so, sorry about that. And so because of that, the ordinances generally talk about 30 days or under 30 days for a short-term rental. As you go through this, we do know what some of your issues are, but there's always the question of what exactly do you want to accomplish with a regulation? And I think some of the things that you want to talk about, Blake has highlighted them, but particularly you want to talk about impacts on neighborhoods. But as you go through, do you want to have, there's a distinction, and I think most of you are familiar with these terms, between hosted and unhosted stays in some of the ordinances. South Portland in particular does not allow unhosted stays in residential zones. You can have unhosted stays in commercial zones or industrial zones where there are houses. But an unhosted stay would mean, obviously, that the owner of the property is not present during the short-term rental. Some towns will have some slightly different regulations so that if you own a house, and I think South Portland has a 2-week exception that you don't have to be in the house for 2 weeks out of the year, and you can do a short-term rental, do an unhosted, but just for that 2-week period. And so that allows some accommodation of people who will tell you, and I think with some justification, that they make so much money on short-term rentals that they can help pay a fair amount of their property taxes in a year. So these are the kinds of things you want to look at. Other things, and I know some of these are of concern in Kennebunk, is, as Blake mentioned, the party houses, the houses that are rented out specifically for the idea of having a large wedding on the site. So you have many guests staying in the house, but then you have an even larger event. And those are things that create problems with parking in the neighborhood, with noise in the neighborhood. And so those are things that you also may want to be looking at. I kind of jumped ahead a little bit on this. You do have to determine initially, if you're going to regulate short-term rentals, whether you're going to do it as either a licensing ordinance, which generally runs through the town clerk's office, whether you're going to do it as a land use ordinance, which obviously runs through the code enforcement office, or a combination of the two. And I think generally, if we are advising on these, we recommend that you at least do a licensing ordinance, because a licensing ordinance, somebody has to come in each year. If there have been violations, then you have the right to suspend or refuse to renew a license. If there have been repeated violations, that's a little bit easier. You have more control over that. With land use, you have to go to court. And of course, that can be slower to enforce under those things. But you may have things in your land use ordinance as well, including saying that short-term rentals are allowed in some zoning districts and maybe not in others. One of the hardest things with enforcement of short-term rentals is that you need to determine how you are going to enforce it. It is a very difficult area to enforce. And so larger communities have hired companies that specialize in this, and one of these is host compliance. And what they do for you is they monitor not just Airbnb, not just Vrbo, but all kinds of other sites to see if people are advertising short-term rentals, because there are a lot of different ways that these get advertised. And if you start saying, okay, we're looking at Airbnb and this is what we're seeing, there's probably a dozen more that you're not seeing that are advertising through another means. And in fact, I think I was reading something recently in a community where there is one house that doesn't even need to advertise anymore because it's just repeat guests each year. And so there's no advertising. So how do you monitor that? So you need to figure that out, how you're going to be able to enforce this, whether you want to hire a compliance agent that helps you figure out when there are violations, and then obviously taking care of those violations then comes back on the town, and staff, whatever the appropriate staff is, has to send out notices of violation and take care of things that way. As I said before, one of the first things you have to determine is, this says who can host, and that comes down to is it hosted or unhosted stays, or both, and are there different regulations for those? And there may be. Use limitations and standards. A very common standard is that parking has to be provided off street. Now, are people actually parking off street? Well, that's a fair question. But you also can regulate, how big the actual individual STRs have to be. So when you're talking about rooming units, you may just rely on the building code, or you may require something larger than that. Are you going to limit how many days out of the year there can be rentals? That's not uncommon. Cape Elizabeth used to allow unhosted rentals for 30 days a year. And my neighbors who were doing short-term rentals at that time did up to 30 days a year. And that was perfectly permissible under the terms of the ordinance. Host operations are requirements of the hosts, and something that South Portland has done that I think is actually a really good thing is what comes next, the good neighbor standards. They put together some standards, and these standards are, please keep in mind that you're in a neighborhood. Keep in mind that your neighbors may be going to work in the morning, and so they may not appreciate if you're coming home from the restaurants back when we went to restaurants at 1 a.m. Please be mindful that you want to be a little quieter when you come home, and those types of things. And if there's some interest in that, we could get to that, but that actually comes much later in the process if you're going to adopt an ordinance. The approval process, if there's a licensing ordinance, what standards does somebody have to meet? What do they get? Do they get a license? And if it's a license, then usually that's an annual license, and there's something in the ordinance that talks about these are the standards you have to meet. What happens if you fail to meet them? And also there has to be obviously enforcement provisions about what happens when people are doing short-term rentals without having gotten the license or the registration or the land use approval that they need to do that. And that needs to be spelled out. You can set up a complaint process. Certainly a lot of short-term rentals come to the town's attention through complaints, that neighbors know better than anybody else what's going on next to them, and they will let you know when they think that somebody's really abusing something. And so if you do adopt an ordinance, it can be helpful for everybody to know what those regulations are. And so someone's doing a short-term rental, but there's really no other complaints about it, then that's the answer to the person. Well, if they're not violating noise standards, or they're not exceeding the number of days per year, or they're doing hosted stays when that's all they're allowed to do, then that's not a violation, and the property owner is allowed to do that. But it helps the neighbors to know what to understand, what to expect, what the regulations are, and what it is they should be calling to complain about. Again, with the enforcement process, with licensing, it is more of an internal process. And what it would end up being if there's a violation of a license or a registration is that there would be a body that would hold, there would be a notice sent out, and somebody would be warned that if they didn't stop doing something, that they would either have their license suspended or they would have it revoked. And obviously, if you're going to suspend or revoke a license, you have to not only do notice, you have to provide an opportunity for a hearing. So you'd have to determine if you're going to have a hearing board, who's going to be on that, whether it's going to be the select board that serves that function, or whether there'll be an interim board, and then appeals of that go to the select board. The select board does not have to be the board that does that, but there does have to be some sort of board. And an initial hearing can be done by a hearing officer, which can be a member of the staff. It can be, if you appoint hearing officers, you don't. But if you have appointed hearing officers, you can have them do it. The important thing is, as always, for due process, notice and hearing, because this, if you are allowing this to be done, there is an argument that there's a property right. You can't take away somebody's property rights without notice and a hearing, which constitutes due process. So these are the types of regulations that you think about, and that we put into an ordinance if you decide to adopt one. Obviously, number 6 is really key to all of this, is that there's going to be a lot of public discussion about this, and there should be. There should be a lot of public input on what the concerns are now, what property owners who are doing short-term rentals, what their concerns are. And as always, coming up with some sort of a balance between those different and sometimes competing sets of interests. So that is kind of what we look at with this. And I will tell you that the hardest piece of it, it's easy to adopt an ordinance. It's hard to enforce it. So you need to know right up front what your enforcement strategy is going to be and what you're willing to invest in and how that's going to work. Because if you have an ordinance and you can't really enforce it, you can't keep track of things, that creates a lot of problems for everybody. It creates them for staff, for you, for the neighbors, for the owners. So that's a really key piece of this if you decide to go forward with an ordinance. And so those are the things that I wanted to talk about, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have for me.
All right. Show of hands here. Who would like Bill Ward?
Yeah, hi.
And Lisa.
Hello. I do have a question about what's happening in the litigation front on these ordinances. I know some of them are new, like Kennebunkport. And I guess my other concern is the so-called good neighbor policy. If Joe lives next to Sally, who has rented her house for 3 weeks on Airbnb, or even through Joe's local realty, and I'm of course assuming that the licensing process would be the same no matter whether I used a local real estate agent to rent my house for a week or whether I used Airbnb. And by the way, just a side note on that, if you have a party house and they get complaints on Airbnb, they can't rent anywhere else anymore. So there is a penalty even with them. Getting back to that, if Joe decides that he doesn't want Sally to rent her house, all he's going to do is make 5 or 6 complaints to Kennebunkport. This is Kennebunkport, and then all of a sudden, if the board isn't fully engaged in the process of dealing with these complaints, and Sally can't rent her house anymore, that means she can't pay her taxes anymore. That means she can't do her repairs on her house anymore. And I don't like the idea that one guy that hates short-term rentals, who happens to be a neighbor of somebody's, will prohibit that person from being able to rent their house. I read that, and it just seems to me a real problem.
Hey, Bill, do you have a question for Natalie? Because
I wanted to ask if there's been any litigation going on this to the towns or between neighbors that you're aware of on these.
I'm not familiar with any litigation, Bill. I thought there was a case that was brought up in South Portland, but it didn't go anywhere. And so our best guess on all of this is that it is fine to regulate, but as is true with any kind of regulatory scheme, you need to be careful to make sure that you have standards that people can understand, And yes, you want to make sure that you don't have an ordinance that is such that if I'm renting something in one neighborhood and then renting something in a different neighborhood in exactly the same manner, the different rules don't get applied to me because neighbors are complaining about it. I think that's a very good point, that you have to have standards that the town makes the ultimate determination as to whether those standards have been violated, not the neighbors, so that you don't end up having, frankly, variable standards in different parts of the town.
Okay, Lisa.
Hi, Natalie, thank you. So since we've been using South Portland as an example, so you said they hired an outside company to regulate or just to monitor it? And then how do they regulate and enforce in South Portland?
I do know that they hire them to monitor, because Lisa, that's the hardest thing for the town to keep track of because of all the different ways it can be done. Because frankly, if you put in regulations, people will drop off Airbnb and they'll find another way to advertise. And so I think mostly the people that they use, and I think they use the same company that Portland uses. I think mostly what they do is monitor. And obviously, because they're doing it for lots of different communities across the country, they can do so. They know where to look, and they send you a notice if somebody's doing something or advertising something. And then it's up to the town to follow up with a letter to somebody saying, it's come to our attention that you're advertising this, you're in violation of our ordinance. If they can register or get a license, you tell them this is what you need to do. You have 30 days to do this. If they don't do it within 30 days, you follow up with another letter. And then if that doesn't bring compliance, then you go on to the next steps from there. Now, obviously, if somebody doesn't have a license, that's going to be a different kind of enforcement than if they do. It's actually easier to enforce if they have a license and they violate, because then you can suspend or revoke the license. If they don't have a license, then you may have to do a court action to get them to stop doing it.
Okay, great. That explains it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Shiloh, and then back to Bill, then to Sally. Well, actually, boarding house rules. We'll go Sally and then Bill. Go ahead, Shiloh.
Thanks, Natalie, and I'm very sympathetic to the idea that you're under time constraint here. The only thing I wanted to say is I feel like we need to know both what is the extent of the current problem or challenges, or what kind of complaints we expect to have now and in the next 5 years, something like that. How do we expect to see the growth? I mean, obviously we can't predict the future perfectly, but what are we trying to forestall here? What kind of problem we forestall before we go down a road of thinking of developing an ordinance or developing a plan around that? So I'm not really sure what the right question is to ask until I know more about what the current state of things are in Kennebunk with short-term rentals, what kind of complaints we've had already, and what sort of challenges we see ahead. So
Shiloh, after Natalie's finished, we're going to go to Chris and to Karen, who have some information in that regard to fill you in. But
okay, but then when are we going to? Then I guess then my question then is, how are we going to handle this for the rest of today if we're not going to be able to go back to talk about a ordinance structure or potential legal actions after hearing the rest of this?
Well, I think
that follow up at a meeting, or
yeah, we're going to have other yeah. I mean, I'm shooting for 90 minutes tonight because that's the normal amount of time we spend in workshops. And your question is a good one. It's the one I asked. What is the problem? And so we need to start there and figure out what is the problem. Is it really a problem? Is it ours to solve?
Right? I did have one other thing then to just a legal question specifically. Are we trying to look at is from this perspective of someone operating a business out of their house, or is it a matter of someone infringing on somebody else's property rights? Because people do Etsy and they do all kinds of other things that they operate out of their house and have for a long time. I mean, moonlighting is how people survive for a long time, and many still do. And those mostly aren't really a problem, but I would imagine that the crux of the matter is maybe not someone operating a business out of their house, but someone infringing on others' that are living in a residential area. So have those issues come up in terms of someone pushing back on this kind of regulation and affecting other businesses? I wouldn't want to do that if we can avoid it.
That's question, yeah.
Sorry.
Shiloh, I don't think that's come up in other municipalities. I think that's because of the somewhat unique nature of this, of having other people come into the home, whereas some of the things that you're talking about, they're doing what's in effect a home occupation, which is something that you allow. And it's only if somebody's doing a home occupation and they've got a ton of employees coming in that municipalities start hearing complaints about it. And usually that's in violation of the zoning ordinance anyway, to have many employees from outside. But I think it is the unique nature of people coming into these homes, and there being a fair amount of turnover with the guests.
I guess then I'm thinking more like a in-home daycare or something. But I guess those are probably pretty heavily regulated already. Okay.
Yes, those are highly regulated both by the town and also by the state. So that's a little bit different. And and also the daycares are providing a service generally to the community. So there's a little bit, that doesn't mean we don't get complaints about daycares too. We certainly do, but I do think it's a little bit different. And so I think that you don't need to worry too much about this issue. Bringing in that issue. I think it's easy to keep them split. At least I hope it is.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Shiloh. Sally, then Courtney, then Bill. Sally?
Yeah, sorry. My question is actually very similar to Shiloh's. I was wondering if we had seen an uptick in the short-term rentals and if we had received any complaints. So I guess I just need to wait for Chris and Karen.
We'll get there. They do have some interesting data. Courtney?
Hey, Natalie, how you doing? So I have a ton of things to talk about after, but my one question for you, Natalie, before you go is, if there were to be some type of certification process, and say that a homeowner has been having short-term rentals for a long time, they go to sell their property. If we go into a certification process, would they be able to legally deed that certification? Say we were, as a town, going to have X amount of certifications and that was it, or that we were going to cut off any new buyers to the town to purchase homes strictly for short-term rental purposes as a hosted or unhosted stay. And I want to sell my house in 20 years and I have short-term rentals. Can I deed that to the owner that they would be able to, is that legally, would we be able to do that?
Courtney, that's a good question. And that shows the distinction between a land use under the zoning ordinance, which is something that typically would run with the land, and between either a registration or a license, which is typically for a term. And for short-term rentals, most of the ordinance is 1 year. And so there can also be a provision in it that says that the license is only good for that owner. And if a new owner comes in, they have to get it. Now, it does become problematic in places like Portland where there's a limitation on how many you can have. And certainly there's a lot of concern about that. But that's true for anything where there's a limit on it. But yes, with the certification and the licensing, I suppose you could let it go with the land, but it would only be for that 1 year period that it would be in effect. And then after that, that person would have to come in just like everybody else and renew or get a new license after that.
Right. Yeah, I think for me, I see it from the angle of, there's obviously pros and cons, like Blake laid out tons of examples that I have as well. And I'm sure the public, like you said, will have both. But I think when you get down to the nitty gritty of how this will go, I think a lot of people's concern is really going to come down to, are people just buying up the houses in Kennebunk strictly for the purpose of investment and short-term rental, right? And so if the house doesn't exist today, then I probably support not having people just build to rent, right? But if someone has lived here forever and they're leaving it to their kids to then sell and it's been a long-term rental, that would be something that would be, the legal part of it would be interesting to me how that would go. So thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. Back to you, Bill.
Yeah, hi. I wanted to deal with a combination of zoning and licensing issues. And that's where you come in, Natalie. Down at the beach area, So if you turned around and said you couldn't have any unhosted stays down there, then what's going to happen is those become like bed and breakfast in effect, and that makes them businesses. Now, unfortunately, down in that area, you're prohibited to have businesses. That's why many years ago, somebody that wanted to open a cart to take hot dogs to the beach was turned down because it's against the ordinance to have that. So, what do you think about that? Is it better for the beach area to do a land use, or I don't see a licensing scheme down there because doesn't that change the definition of the property?
Well, it can. They certainly can be defined as commercial uses. I will note that I believe under your zoning ordinance, there actually is a provision where you can rent out up to 2 rooms, I think. That's an allowed use in residential areas already. And I don't think there's a particular time period associated with that. And that's something we want to keep in mind. And there are some people in town who do that. And we will need to figure out how to make that work if you do decide to also adopt a short-term rental regulation. Also, a lot of those are longer-term rentals. There are people who are renting rooms for months at a time or even years at a time. And it's for the same thing. It's for people who need to make money to help cover their property taxes. But as far as turning it into an actual B&B as opposed to an Airbnb, that's certainly not the intent, to allow somebody to go from something that is supposed to be residential adjacent to something that's not residential at all. And I think that's part of the complaint you're getting, is that with some of the unhosted stays, it doesn't feel very residential to the neighborhood at this point because of all of the various aspects. And there is money changing hands for it. It's not like somebody's letting people use their house out of the goodness of their heart. They're making money for it, and if they can, that's fine. But I don't think that with the registration and the hosted versus the unhosted, that we're then going to be getting into a situation where you have to allow B&Bs, because this is a relatively new use, and I don't think it was foreseen, just as we never thought Ubers would be a thing.
Natalie, there you
You can
go.
go ahead while I cough, sorry.
That's all right. So Bill, I guess anybody else from the board before we move on to the public? Okay, Ed, you're up first, and then an unidentified party. Ed?
Come on, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, we're good. My symbol didn't come up here. Okay, guys, I think this has been brought up in the past, and it has been brought up when there's certain neighbors in the community who are asking the question, how can we have a business in that particular case, the coastal residential area? Because I don't care how you look at it, it's a business. And I had passed by the house in question when we had brought this up before, and there were 14 cars in the driveway. I mean, logically, common sense says this is not just a homeowner who wants to rent their house out for a couple of weeks to make a few extra bucks. It's a business. And if businesses are not allowed in a coastal residential area, I think the answer is very simple. You close them down. You close them down. I don't know if anybody has the nerve to do that, but I think that's what should happen.
Well,
I
Ed,
think the other-
Ed, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. With this
sir.
this part of our workshop is devoted to Natalie. So do you have a legal
Yep.
question for Natalie? We have
Well,
time for.
Okay, yeah, I'm rolling into that, but I wanted to get that off my chest. Natalie, and this goes back to when we brought this up before on a previous board. I had brought up Sanford and the fact that they do regulate rentals. They license rentals, and the money that they make from rentals goes toward paying for an additional person who just takes care of rental properties. The answer we got at the time, Natalie, was that you didn't think this was legal, but I've heard a couple times you mentioning licenses. So I just didn't know whether it's been refined a little bit or whether your present answer and the fact that you can license these facilities is correct.
Well, and I think that we were talking about, what we were talking about before was licensing of residential facilities for protected populations. And I said that I thought that was problematic. And I know Sanford has an ordinance that did require licensing of those types of residences. And I said I
Okay.
didn't think that was
Okay.
going to fly. This is different because it's a different type of use and it's not serving a protected population.
Okay, and I think I brought up at the time that Sanford, the way they got around just trying to regulate or license a protected population is by licensing all rental properties. And one last thing, well, no, two things real quick, so maybe I don't have to come back again. But I think one extremely, probably the most important part that's not been mentioned here is safety. Okay, Blake, you mentioned the fact that you found out that there was an Airbnb with 16 rooms. How could
Beds.
you have,
Beds.
huh?
Beds.
Okay, beds. How could you have a facility in town with 16 beds that's not even close to being regulated? Are there fire hazards? Should our fire department be checking on these places at least once a year to make sure that they are safe, so that we don't read in the paper one morning that 12 people have died, like happened in Portland because these things weren't properly taken care of. And that was one of the big things about the Sanford program. It gave them the opportunity to go into places once a year to inspect them for safety.
Okay,
And,
Ed, I'm gonna cut you off because we're trying to
Yep,
get
go.
Natalie out of the, we got to get Natalie out of the meeting here because.
Okay, go for it.
All right, I'll come
Thank
back
you.
to you, Ed, I promise.
Yeah, thank
You have
you very
15
much.
minutes, Blake.
There's a telephone number up here with their hand up. Okay, so 207467, and I won't do the last four digits.
If she's been given permission to, or that person has been given permission to speak.
Would you like to speak? I don't want to read your telephone number out loud, but there's an unidentified person with a 467.
They're just on mute still.
Blake, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, my Zoom doesn't work. Hi, it's George Harrington.
Hi, George. How you doing?
Yeah. I don't have a question for Natalie, so I'll pass for the moment, but I would like to speak on the subject, please.
Oh, absolutely. We'll come back to you, George.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you appear twice here. You're already in the meeting under George C. Harrington, so maybe that's the
Oh,
issue.
yeah, but I'm not on the screen and I
I
can't,
got you.
I
Okay,
can't do anything.
all right. I'll come back to you, George, I promise. All right,
Thank you.
so I don't see anyone else from the public. Board, do you have any other questions for Natalie before she goes off to celebrate?
Yeah, I think I will have more, but I think we'll have to hear the rest first. So
Yeah,
probably
no
another
doubt.
day.
Yeah, we'll come back to it. Natalie, we'll invite you back for probably many more sessions on this subject. I think we're just at the headwaters of this process.
Yes, and I think that if at the end of your discussion, the board determines that there is some interest in proceeding in one way or another, probably the next best step is for us to pull together some ordinances. I know some of you have reviewed ordinances, but it would be good to see the different types of regulations that other municipalities have done and see what you do and don't like in those, and craft something that works well for the town of Kennebunk, not just grab something because somebody else did it.
Okay, Natalie, it looks like Courtney has a question for you.
Yeah, Natalie, just one more question in regards to that. So say that we did go forward with an ordinance and the residents would have to come and sign for a certificate or license, whatever that would be. I'm assuming obviously you would help us draft that, but would that also when they're signing off for these licenses or certification, is there any way legally to include removing the town from any liability in the instance? The first thing I had written down was fire department and sewer. So if something were to happen in that instance, is the town in that cert application hands clean?
Courtney, I think I've seen some ordinances that have that kind of language. My own opinion is that it's not necessary because those are not things for which you should have liability in the first place unless
Right.
you've done something really grossly wrong, in which case you'll have liability regardless of what the ordinance says. But I can't think of that's something that we certainly can look at through the process.
Okay,
see
yeah, I wasn't
what-
sure if where money's
what it was.
exchanged
Mhm.
or, or something like that, if that would be the case, but that's enough for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. All right, last call for Natalie Burns here. Anyone have a legal question? Natalie, we appreciate you taking time out of what should have been a celebratory evening. We appreciate you spending time with us. No doubt we will have you back many more times to help us with this, should we decide that regulation or licensing or land use ordinance is the way forward.
Thank you. And next time I promise that I'll be available for the entire meeting. I appreciate you accommodating me.
Have a wonderful evening and
Thanks,
happy
good evening.
birthday to your husband.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, so now we're going to turn to Chris and Karen, or Karen and Chris, depending upon who's going to speak first here. And they have some interesting data. I've got a brief glimpse of it, a little preview. But they're going to answer some of the questions that Shiloh posed and others as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris and Karen.
Karen, you want to correct me, or do you just want me to say whatever I think? Okay. This topic has come up a little bit. Certainly within the code enforcement office, we experience a lot of aspects of it. We do get the community complaints. We have had an awareness of different issues. So we looked into this about a year ago. What Natalie referenced in South Portland uses a firm called Host Compliance. I think Portland uses the same. We had a informational phone call with them, and what they do is they kind of screen the community. They look online and they look at all the identified listings. So that's not a true snapshot of all what actually happened. So at that time, what they pretty much showed us is how this market has developed. In 2001, they identified about 1 million short-term rental listings. In 2016, that was up to 15 million. So basically, I think what you're realizing is this isn't just unique to Kennebunk, it's everywhere. So people's expectations are evolving, and to try to pretend it isn't happening, it's right in front of you, just may not know it. Within the town of Kennebunk, they had identified, I think, about 340 in 2019. That number jumped up to about 389. And again, these are just listed on the website that they can find on the internet, not just what is actually happening. We expect that number is probably closer to 500. Realistically, the reason why I can say that is in the town of Kennebunk, there's about 6,200 households and about 4,900 of them are occupied. So you've got capacity right there. With everything that's going on, that just tells you there's more and more ongoing. What they're able to do is also map where it's happening, and rightfully so. Predominantly it is down south of Western Avenue, but it's also throughout town. It's right around downtown. It's all throughout urban neighborhoods. So, I mean, it's a little bit of everything. And I think that's what's difficult about it. Some things that they're to provide for data that I thought was very interesting, though, is 93% of it was actually renting the entire home. So it wasn't just like you're renting out an extra room. That's the data that they have found. So you do have entities out there who can kind of give you a snapshot of what's available. That doesn't mean it tells you what your issues are. I think what they also do is they are also a service. They're trying to help you manage something. That's clearly where they come from. So they're trying to show you that opportunity. And they definitely come at it from the lens of how do you regulate people? And that's a service they provide. But really, it helped us recognize, okay, we do have these issues. I think there are quality of life issues that happen. As we started to see this happening in neighborhoods along Sea Road, and it crept inward in those non-traditional areas, that's when we started to hear about it. People who've lived in a neighborhood for 35, 40 years suddenly start to see this happening. They don't know their neighbors anymore. It's not just traveling from Florida for the winter. It's not coming back. So that's where I think we're starting to see grow, trying to understand. I think Natalie also mentioned some things that are difficult because Within our ordinances, we do allow for renting of rooms, but not in all zoning districts. So the primary district that this happens is in the coastal residential zone. Renting of rooms is not an identified permitted use. Well, certainly, again, that's renting a room, not renting a home. So you have a mishmash of things that have happened over the years. We're very well aware of it. What we don't get, though, and I think this is telling in some way, is the complaints we get are somewhat limited. Where you look at where a lot of this is happening, it tends to be in the neighborhoods that are fairly seasonal, but it is growing outward. So it's something we have to get a handle on and understand how we want to approach it. Handling it from a pure land use perspective is very difficult. It does introduce enforcement challenges. You heard all that. So I think we're trying to grasp what is the magnitude of the problem. Shiloh, your point, where's it going? It's not decreasing. How much is it going to increase? I think it's becoming so prevalent and easy to do. It's only going to expand, and there's opportunity there. If you look at what happened with COVID, this is some of the more easier things to do, to try to get to a community, to be accessible, to be somewhat distanced from people. There's more opportunity for that to be part of the community. So I think getting our arms around what the problem is certainly a priority. That's probably where I'd stop for now, because there's a lot more we don't know, but we have to understand. So,
Chris, do you tally any of the complaints? I mean, do you have any data on how many complaints have been made, or just anybody, does that just come in through all transoms?
More so now, since we swapped to our new software database, we are much better about our complaint process in terms of how we track and investigate them. Before, a lot of it was anecdotal. I think sometimes what happened is because some happened in passing, or complaints would come in the form of questions. My neighbor's doing this, is this allowed? So you could sense something maybe going on, but you didn't know the extent to what it went on. So it's much more of an awareness. We do have some people who can outwardly point to something and say, look, there's somebody different living there all the time. Why is that happening in my neighborhood? It's never happened. That's not widespread, but where it's happening in areas where you don't normally expect it. What I suspect is when you go down along, I'll say the beach area, just to be generic, where so much of that is seasonal that it probably happens all the time and people just get used to it. So I wouldn't want to suggest that it's accepted or widespread, but we definitely know when we start to see it happen in places that it doesn't normally happen, it's much more prevalent than that. So I don't think I have a number, but if I said it was 5, it's probably at least 50 just because of it. And it takes people, I think what we have seen is this: we get our complaints toward the end of the year. Things start up in May and June, and people kind of it's when they sort of get built up and say, oh, I've had it. And then it sort of subsides. So the seasonality does make it difficult to track as well.
Thank you, Chris. Bill?
Good question, Chris. The number you quoted, say 389.
Yep.
It's kind of a two-for question. One is it been a spike? I think you answered this already. COVID kind of gave us a spike in these rentals, not only at the beach but inland, I'm guessing.
So that number was basically it was up about 40 from the year before, and that was a trend that was just continuing to grow. I don't even think that was influenced by COVID. That was just the market speaking. What I think I'm suggesting is COVID has exposed people to other ways to take advantage of that. And we see that growing. We don't have a latest census in terms of where we think it's at today. When that was taken in October of 2020, I think people are still navigating what did COVID mean, right? You were about 5 months into that whole piece. So the restrictions of what you could travel into the state when that sort of got lifted in July and all of that, I'm not sure they knew the extent of it and that was properly capturing it. And again, those were just available online listings. What I think you're going to see is the market exposing itself more. And we're probably ripe to go out and do a new inventory of that. I think we tried to do that internally and found out we don't quite have those resources to scour the internet like some of these firms do, but they'll do that very willingly. If we were to do that again, I fully suspect that number is going to be much higher and only growing.
My other question, and they're probably the more important question. I know I did some research ahead of all the meeting we had on this about a year or so ago. And I knew from Kennebunk Beach Realty and from one other realty that there's probably in the Kennebunk and Lower Village area, there was probably about 300 and some odd rentals. Those were coming just through. They didn't know about Airbnb. So my question is 389 on top of the 350 they had?
I would say they're independent. So when you look at what they were doing, they looked at 5 data sources. They looked at Booking.com, Airbnb, Expedia, and I think there's one other prominent one. So I mean, Some of them may have been overlapped, but you just pointed something that's very critical. A lot of these local rentals, people who've been doing this generationally, and they've gone back to that, that's not even being identified as part of that market. So that's why I'm fairly confident number well exceeds the 389 I quote, because there's a whole nother right in front of us element that goes on all the time and always has. We've gotten used to it. It's probably not as accessible to somebody who's in New York or something.
Yeah, when I was a kid, there were people renting houses by the week, especially from July and August, for as long as I can remember, and before I was even born. So I mean, that for down people that live on the beach, this is a norm, not a new thing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think that kind of goes back to the issue of the complaint, which makes it a challenge. Is some of this is going on. We've gotten used to not hearing something that we see all the time in terms of people parking in the street and those types of things that become a seasonal way of life. I don't mean to say it's acceptable, but where you would expect more of it, it doesn't come because of that. So in an entire neighborhood that seems to evolve, it's much harder to get that type of actual complaint because of it.
Okay, anything else, Chris or Karen? Any other insight into this?
Karen, you must have something really you want to add. Save me.
Well, one point I was going to bring up that hasn't yet been discussed is a little bit of a philosophical discussion in terms of what the town wants to have for housing stock and what the town wants to have for residents. So when I first started here and was working in the general assistance program, we had lots of little pockets of housing that was pretty affordable for renters, for year-round long-term tenant renters. One of those was the Turnpike Motel, which has since been demolished and lost, but that was actually a really good source of not only emergency housing, but some people lived there long-term, years, renting rooms, and it was an option in town. It was an option on the spectrum of housing, that's available. So we had other pockets in town where you just, you knew people either multifamily or a second property that they managed and offered as that year-round long-term rental housing that was, I'm going to use the word affordable. It was in a general sense, it was affordable for people. And it was everything from rooming houses to, single family homes that were these rentals. And what's just happened over the last several years is they're completely drying up, completely. Everyone who has operated these is turning to short-term rental because it's so much more profitable. So there's a consequence to that. And just letting it happen or determining that this isn't a problem, there's that other side to it. It's the consequence of what do we want to have in our town? What kind of housing stock? What kind of residents do we want to allow for, people that would live in the rooming houses I'm talking about? They worked at Amato's and Dunkin' Donuts and Irving, they're providing a service in our town that are keeping businesses operating and all of us, with coffee and gasoline and those types of things. So it's actually a pretty important piece of our community that's now starting to really disappear. And the other thing I would add from my experience is over the last year, I've received many calls from long-term renters who are just nowhere near needing social services, nowhere near needing general assistance, but just desperate for housing because the property owner where they were long-term tenants are taking advantage of the market and seeing how they can have a little bit more of, more profit, and it's just a different model that they're using. So instead of it being this long-term tenant that I'm talking about, people I've heard from, they're retirees, they're still working in the service industry, they're nurses, various types of people that are now that piece is going to be missing for our community. It's already disappearing and it's going to be missing.
Thank you, Karen. Questions for Karen and Chris? Courtney, do you have a question?
I actually just had a comment on what Karen just said. Another philosophical thought, I guess, is, our neighbors in Kennebunkport, I think talking to residents, some of their thought process was, we're going to lose our community. They're obviously in a very different situation than Kennebunk because of year-round residents and things like that. But, it's a ghost town in the winter. Everyone's known that forever. But now it's really not, because a lot of those houses are being rented year-round. But who is short-term year-round, but still being rented? I think that when you talk to people though, they're like, it's not even that we minded the short-term rentals so much. It's that exactly what Karen just said. Who is going to make the decisions for the town? Who's going to be so invested in their community that owns these houses, that runs for positions of people on this screen? And I think that that's what Kennebunkport was dealing with. And I don't necessarily feel that way here in terms of us ever losing that full sense of community, but I completely align with you, Karen, on a lot of missed opportunity on the housing. On the flip side though, my wife is a travel nurse, and she could go online right now and find what you're calling affordable, right? We know it isn't, but affordable housing, and it's also helping that homeowner out. So funny enough, I'm sitting in an Airbnb right now with my wife, who is a travel nurse in Brunswick, and we are here for the week so that she doesn't have to commute. In our town, we know of maybe a half dozen that are doing the same situation in Kennebunk right now. But again, they're not committed to our community, right? I'm not committed to Brunswick. I don't even know where I am. So you're making a really good point.
Thank you, Courtney. Bill?
A couple of things before I wanted to have you guys delve more into the nature of the complaints and how many complaints and growth in complaints and type of complaints. I really wanted to hear more about that, but I want to just throw some historical perspective in here. Back, Carol, you'll appreciate this. Back in 1963, when we first moved here from Ohio, we were only up here in the summer before. The rent for a house down there by the beach in the middle of winter was $100 a month. Now, I just wanted to give you that perspective. And of course, to buy a house at the beach was cheaper back then because, the local thought was, no, any darn idiot would live near the ocean because one big wave will wipe you out. I remember hearing that from people living in downtown Kennebunk. Oh, you're a fool to live by the water. So all that thinking has now changed. We've gone a complete change. By the time we get to the 70s, we became more desirable. Rents went up, and in the 90s, when I was renting, it was about $600 a month for a winter rental in the Kennebunk Lower Village area. Just to give you some perspective on that. Now envision what it is today, and you can see the explosive growth in property values and rental values. There's no affordability down there, no matter how you do it. Not when a raw piece of land is $380,000 and an affordable houses. Well, all right.
Thank you, Bill. Lisa?
Two things. So I just want to reiterate what Karen said, that I think that that's really important. I think that, we've been having conversations about low cost housing, and we need to keep that in mind. And I'm glad that Karen brought that up, what we want to have in our community for service workers. So that's one thing. And then this is just for anybody. I'm not sure who can answer this. And this is just my naivete. But when we say that people need to rent their homes out to cover their property taxes, I don't understand what that means. So where are they going when they're renting their houses out? So why can they not afford their property taxes? Does that make sense? Like, I don't understand.
I can hit that one.
Okay.
You may not realize this, Lisa, but down when you get down to the Lower Village and the beach, for those of us that were long-term people that lived down there, we lived down there when we bought the houses for $25,000. And all of a sudden, because of the explosive growth in the market, the houses jumped up and became worth $1.2 million. Our incomes didn't grow along with the value of that house. So all of a sudden, my mother, who was in her 80s, was living on a $60,000 a year income, was getting its property tax bill for $30,000 a year. Now, and so are other people. There's a house down on Great Hill Road, a great example. These people moved from New Hampshire, bought a house up here that was for sale, started renovating it, suddenly realized their property tax was going to be $35,000 for their $1.8 million house that they bought to renovate. And so consequently, they were using short-term rentals to help complete the renovations and pay for that. And they were only being able to come up here and live. A friend of mine that lives in Kennebunkport, she rents her house 2 to 3 weeks a year to help pay her property taxes over there because her property taxes have grown, income hasn't. So what does she do? She comes over and stays downstairs in my guest room for 2 weeks when she's in town. I mean, she works as a professional, and she travels out of state most of the week. So she's only really here for 2 nights a week. But so her home is being rented out during that period of time. just so you know. So yes, people do that. They have to make adjustments in their lives. They want to keep their family homes. They don't want to have to surrender them because somebody else paid too much for the house next door, so that jacks their property taxes up. So they rent their house out to maintain their property taxes. So it's very prevalent. It happens at the beach and it happens in the port too. And of course now they have to deal with this licensing thing and the fear that some neighbor will complain. And that's why I really want to get back to the core issue of, before we start controlling people's lives and start limiting people's, and the argument that, and I'll go into the argument about the civil argument later about the character of the neighborhood and all that stuff. I'll deal with that in a separate topic. You're impacting how people pay to maintain and keep their homes. We live in an area where we're paying 52% of a school tax, and we're paying, and the school budget is already at over 50 million a year. It's impacting people, especially when they get older and they have and their incomes become more fixed.
Okay, Bill, thank you. Let's open it up to the public. George and then John, George Harrington, and then John Costin.
Can you hear me now, Blake?
Yes, George.
Yeah. My name is George Harrington. My wife and I have had a house down at the beach for 50 years, and we have certainly seen the changes as Bill described. There's no question about it. But what I've noticed in my small neighborhood, there's 10 houses that are on VRBO around me. They're 2 minutes away. 10 houses. These were once owned by families. I knew the grandparents, I knew the parents, I knew the grandchildren. I don't know anybody anymore. My neighborhood has totally changed. And it's not, in my humble opinion, it's not for the better, because they're all rented for 1 week at a time. There's 4, 5, 6 cars in every driveway. It's very difficult to maneuver. And my main concern that I would like to stress tonight is what Ed said. The safety issue to me is the primary issue. Let's talk about that house that Ed and Blake talked about. I've got the listing right here in front of me. 7 bedrooms, 11 beds, sleeps 18. Okay, this house was built over 100 years ago. It's a wooden house. It's got 3 floors. I see no external fire escapes. Do you think they have smoke detectors or fire extinguishers in there? I'm only 2 houses away. The wind comes off the beach. If there's a fire, I know how wonderful our fire department is, but they're never going to get in there in time. That thing's going to go up like a Roman candle, and the whole neighborhood will go up with them. With all the cars parked in the streets, it's hard for the trucks to get by. I am in favor of some type of licensing that would involve inspections for safety reasons. I don't know if you've been down the beach. We're all small lots. The lots are 5,000, 7,000 square feet. We're all right up against each other. The houses are all wooden. These are all tinderboxes. And my God, we're dealing with the safety issues. How about the fire pits? The neighbors around me now all have fire pits. These people show up for a week. They've never seen a fire pit before, and they're lighting it up like crazy. I don't want to disagree with Bill because I agree with most of what he said, but I am extremely concerned with the safety aspect of this whole situation. And the people that are doing this are not from here. In fact, some of them are even out of the country. This has become a thing. One of my neighbors has bought 3 houses. 3 houses. He's renting 3 houses out. He's hardly ever there. So sorry for the rant, but I am distressed. It's a safety issue as far as I'm concerned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. We understand. John, you're next. John Costin.
Yeah. Hello, this is actually Rachel. I'm having some computer problems, so we're on one computer tonight.
Okay.
Thank you for this discussion. I think it's really important and timely, if not overtime. I have to say, I have had a lot of history with Airbnb. I've had My feelings have been all over the map over the last many, like, you know, probably over a decade that I've been, you know, sort of a customer with Airbnb. And, you know, what I would say is that I feel like without question, Airbnb is distorting our communities. It's distorting our economy. It's distorting our affordable housing stock. It's disrupting our rental market, and it's only going to get more so. And I think that Airbnb has a function and a purpose. I think that sort of initially it was, you know, sort of initial concept was really good, that you know, people can make some money and share some of the space that they have. That's clearly been wildly distorted and by many people and using the short-term rental market. People buying apartments and houses and just using them for short-term rental. And, you know, I think that's different than beach rentals, you know, where they're renting out their house on the beach for the winter. My kids stayed for 9 months at a beautiful bungalow on Pine Point last month. They were there for 9 months. That sort of thing can be very helpful for a community. We actually had a situation where we had a small apartment and we thought, well, we did the math. We probably could have made a lot more money renting it out by the weekend or by the week in the summer. And we were like, nope, we're not going to do that. We want to rent it to someone who can live there for the year at an affordable rate and have an affordable housing unit in our market, which is what we did. I think that regulations are absolutely imperative. I think that we need to license Airbnbs and they need to be regulated. The Airbnbs that I'm familiar with, I have some friends that have lovely Airbnbs in their home. They live there. The Airbnb is there. They host. They're there 24/7 along with their guests. And it works very well. And that's a lovely thing. And it really does provide an opportunity for people to be in this community in different ways. But when the unhosted houses and the houses that are really only function for short-term rentals absolutely distort and disrupt our economy, our housing market, our affordable housing, and our community in pretty substantial and significant ways. And I think we absolutely must get into the fray here and regulate and require licenses and regulate the short-term rental market. It's only going to get worse and go downhill from here.
Yeah.
And John, I can lower my hand, but then John's going to raise his.
Okay.
So I'll do that.
Thank you, Rachel. Let's see, we have Susan McCarthy is next, and then I'll come back to you, John, I promise.
Hi, guys. It's actually not Susan McCarthy. It's Kathy Ostrander Roberts sitting in with Susan. Hi.
Hi, Kathy.
Hi, guys. We're kind of double teaming on the computer tonight, and I am notorious for playing devil's advocate, and please don't shoot me for doing so. But being in the real estate market, I see short-term rentals as a selling point, and they do raise our prices. But my bigger question is, why is the town wanting to regulate something that I feel the insurance companies are regulating and apparently
Insurance.
Hello.
Hello.
John, can you mute yourself, please? Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. I'll get back to you. I think there are some liabilities to the people who indulge in this behavior, and for better or for worse, insurance being one of them. If your home burns down and you've got a list of tenants in there that aren't supposed to be there, you're in deep trouble. Not only that, I feel like the state is weighing in on a lot of these Airbnbs. Are they getting their 7% hospitality tax? So I'm not really sure where the town wants to weigh in on this and add manpower tax, the constituents for maintaining a vigilant watch on these things. That said, I do think that licensing would protect a lot of the neighborhoods, from the safety aspect, as George Harrington said, and so forth. So I just think I think it comes down to how much involvement does the town need and want to be involved in this process. I don't know if that makes sense, but anyway, that's my thought.
Thank you.
This is Susan McCarthy.
Oh, Susan, are you speaking now?
I am speaking now. I've muzzled Kathy.
Okay, can I come back to you, Susan? Because we're going around the horn here.
Yes.
All right, so if you'll mute, I'm going to go to Ed Carrico, then John, and then back to Susan. And then I see you, Courtney.
Good.
Ed?
Yeah, thank you, Blake. I think the whole discussion tonight is, as people have said before me, extremely important. And it's not an easy decision. And I think this is one of those decisions where, the board has to really pony up and just not try to please everybody, because it's never going to happen. If everybody thinks on your board that you're going to be able to please everybody, it's not going to happen. So you're going to have to really look at what you think the best thing to do for our community and for the people who pay taxes and live in this community, and go from there. Courtney, I have to ask you one question. Why aren't you staying at a motel versus an Airbnb?
Well, because my wife is here for 4 nights, and she is actually cooking dinner as we speak. And this is 6 minutes from her hospital that she's currently working at. And this home is hosted by an elderly retired couple who has created this apartment in their basement, basically, to do exactly what this discussion has been based around, paying their bills.
Okay, and can I assume it's cheaper than staying in a motel? Can I assume that? Okay,
No, it is not. It is not.
Okay.
But it has a full kitchen, and she's able to cook dinner right now. So instead of having to go out to a restaurant after a 12-hour shift or spend money in the restaurant right now, because she's working, it's just the accessibility, Yeah,
okay. And it's interesting because it does give you a little bit more accessibility and more flexibility than would be in staying in a motel where you have to now go out to eat, etc.
Right.
And it gives you a little bit more space probably. But being in a, that was one, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, like, maybe 1 or 2 of the nights when she's here, she might go out to eat or grab something to bring back, but it's just nice to kind of feel more like at home than on a business trip where I stay in a hotel, multiple nights a week type thing. I think it's all circumstantial.
Yeah, okay. Because that was one of the things that Blake had mentioned in his little presentation, how it impacts the local businesses, the bed and breakfasts and the motels, et cetera. And it does. Just to reinforce a couple things, I do know a contractor who was working on a house over in Cape Porpoise. It was going to be strictly an Airbnb. And that party that, as I was told, the party that bought that house and was converting it into an Airbnb has another house up in Rangeley, and there, it's like been mentioned, it's a business. It's a business in residential areas. I think that's, really that's about all I have. It's going to be a tough nut to crack, but I think the board's going to have to make a decision one way or another. Because there are residents who buy their homes in a residential area, coastal residential or residential area, for one reason. It's quiet. They're not living downtown in a commercial area. They buy their homes in a residential area. And then all of a sudden, when things of a commercial nature start surfacing, they get a little concerned. Why not just put a grocery store next to them versus an Airbnb? It doesn't make any difference. It's a business. I don't care how you look at it. It's still a business. They're paying taxes to the state for the rentals, okay? And the state is looking at them as a business. And if businesses are not allowed in a residential area, then they should not exist. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. John, to you.
Thanks. So when that microphone doesn't have a red slash through it, that means it's on. Is that how this works?
Yes.
Just kidding. I love everybody. So I think it's important, and Blake, I think you said this at the outset of this meeting, but I just want to reiterate, I think it is very, very important that as the town proceeds through this process, we be very clear about what the bigger policy aims and bigger issues that we're trying to address through any action or inaction really are, because it is going to drive what we do. And, you know, there may be, clearly there are some people who feel that short-term rentals really don't present any problems. Fine. I've heard people talk about different kinds of problems that they think that short-term rentals present. And if the town is going to take some kind of action, that action has to be driven by what we're trying to achieve, not just the sense that like there is a problem or that it is bad. For myself, you know, as Rachel said, and, you know, I think Karen, you spoke very eloquently about, really spoke to the issue, that really the biggest issue that I think the town as a town should be concerned about is the distortion of the housing market. And I think that a lot of us didn't really see this coming at the beginning of this internet driven short-term rental phenomenon that Airbnb is the best one known of. But, you know, the way that I think about it is, you know, if I go to one or several Airbnb properties 7 days out of a year, in addition to the home I own, I've bought a 50th of another home. So it just takes 50 of me taking a week to take a living unit out of the market that's available, you know, either for a year-round person to purchase or a year-round person to rent. And we are struggling in this community and nationally with a shortage of housing units. I mean, this is really driving so much. You know, certainly along the coasts, we're part of it. We know that it is creating problems for our communities. Now, in my opinion, beach homes that have been second homes for a long time, that would never really be accessible for the majority of people, are not as much of an issue. You know, I would recommend that as the town, you know, looks at potential actions, and again, I'm recognizing the town may decide to do nothing. But as we look at potential actions, that we really try to keep things in as sharp a focus as possible to drive the options. And you know, I just want to put out that I think that the biggest issue is the removal of, I'll just call them more affordable housing options from the market that this just by math drives. And that's the thing that I would most like to see the town address. There may be some other issues that we try to tie it up with. Maybe we want to say, hey, we're going to regulate in such a way, we're going to charge a tax or fee on short-term rentals. Since they're so lucrative, it's going to be high, and some of that money is going to be applied towards creating more affordable housing options. You know, my gut sense is that that's not really going to solve the problem we're facing. But I think that if we make sure that we clearly identify the problems, then we're going to be able to better align the actions that we take or don't take with it. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Susan, back to you.
Thank you, Blake. You know, what I am seeing, you know, I've been in the area for, 28 years or whatever. And I think what we're seeing here is we're so close to the proximity of, Boston. Our place is changing. I moved here 28 years ago for the school district. I moved because it was a good place to live and bring up children. And it continues to grow and develop. And I don't think, telling people that they can't, offer rent their houses, I don't think it's going to change. It's not going to bring us back to the way things were, 25, 30, 40 years ago. And I think it's, a way of life. And, it is being monitored by the state and with the taxes. And as Kathy had pointed out, the insurance companies, you know, I managed a long-term rental or Airbnb for a couple of years down in the New Hampshire market because my mother was sick. She was living with my sister and we needed to pay for her health care. I can tell you our insurance policy was pretty astronomical because we legitimately told the insurance company that we were renting and we were covered with that. And, you know, noise complaints and unruly behavior are going to be managed by the noise ordinances and such. If I have a complaint, no.
Our noise ordinance is not enforceable, unfortunately.
Well, well, that's good to know. But I think that, you know, I think the good neighbor, you know, I have a neighbor who has, you know, purchased a home and they do plan on putting some Airbnb in there to help them supplement their additional expenses. And, you know, hopefully all goes well. And, you know, but I'm certainly not ready to, you know, make their life miserable because they're trying to put some additional income and to help support their second home as well. So basically that's it. I just think that, you know, I hate to hear people referring to people as they're from away and all of that. I mean, it makes, personally, I just think it really makes us, you know, sound very unwelcoming. But, and I know we aren't. I love this town. I can't see myself living in any other town ever, but it really disappoints me when I hear, you know, people referring to people as from away. I know I'm away, you know, I'll never be a native here in Maine, but I love this town and I don't think we should try to make life difficult for people.
Thank you, Susan. I'm from away, but I do believe there's an interim step. You become a local, and that's something that all of us can earn one way or another. So we're going to go, Ed, we're going to go to the board and wrap this up, I think. So Courtney, you're up, then Sally, then Lisa, and then Shiloh.
All right, so I've been listening to everything and I took a ton of notes, like 8th grade, pretty bad. So we talked about, you know, the safety things, obviously fire department. I look at like the sewer being a concern. People talked about loss of community, the service jobs being jeopardized, which really they're being like overworked. It's kind of the opposite right now. Blake, you had mentioned, you know, the couch thing being a thing for a while. There's couchsurfer.com, which is still very active. I think associating the name Airbnb with the short-term rentals is also what's causing a lot of the kind of the thought around it. I listened to George about his whole neighborhood being, you know, eaten up by people who purchased just to rent. And it's interesting because the people who sold those houses to buyers were his old neighbors. So, you know, that was their choice. And just like anything, I think the way that people invest, it's going to be their decision. So Rachel mentioned, you know, that she had an apartment she could have rented, but chose not to go that route. I listened to Susan's point about, or excuse me, Kathy's point about seeing the home values go up when a rental is available. All the houses around me, there's 3 houses down right now that's going up for just under $1 million. It has a smaller lot than me because it has 2 accessory apartments that can go with it. So I totally understand all that. And to Susan's point, I completely agree with that as well about not wanting to tell people what to do, not wanting to change, you know, our town. But to me, I think the problem is excess at this point. The way I see it is excess. It's not that there's been issues to the point where we've had newspaper headlines and you guys, you know, Chris mentioned there's been reports, but it doesn't sound like we're getting reports weekly and this meeting was an emergency. I'm also not downplaying the fact that neighborhoods and neighbors are not as happy with, you know, what's happening. I think Kennebunk's always been a tourist town and there's always been summer people. And over my lifetime, I'm 32, a lot of those summer people are now, you know, moving here, buying houses. And they've been able to find them with the mindset of, well, I used to rent here, so I'm going to buy something in Kennebunk and do what I did, which is rent to people to come to Kennebunk like I did when I was a kid. So it's just a process of, I think, how we as a town has sort of evolved. I don't agree with Ed in terms of completely cutting Airbnbs. And the reason that I don't is because I don't feel that we have enough hotel rooms, especially in this COVID world and what will someday become a post-COVID world. Kennebunk has become very much a 9 to 12 month, community, I think, from visitors and tourism. And oftentimes our hotels were seasonal, and even now they're not, and they're totally booked. This summer, we had friends come into town that tried to get a hotel. They're 2-night minimums because of the lack of workers. They don't want to have to flip the rooms as often. So what we're having to do is 2-night minimum. They were going to have to spend $1,000 to stay at a hotel in Kennebunk, whereas they could have an Airbnb, split that with 4 or 6 people, cook all their meals, and save a little bit. But that room still ended up getting booked from someone else for $1,000. So I know everyone knows all these things. I just think that the best way to please both sides, in my opinion, would be to put some type of licensing or certification in process here from the town. And first and foremost is the safety. But the people who have lived here forever, the neighbors who are suddenly having investors and renters, they deserve to still feel like they live in a community. George mentioned his neighbor bought 3 homes, all for rental. I think there should be a way that we can kind of limit that. That's just my personal opinion. I'm not saying people can't invest and make money. This is some people's retirement plan. However, I think that we have to weigh safety with making money. People are making enough of it. So moving forward, when we talk about this discussion, my personal opinion for people to sort of, mull over is possibly putting a cap on certification or licenses that would be allowed in the town. And also possibly set a date that from this date forward, any houses that are purchased would not be allowed to get a certification once we've hit that cap. So say that we allowed 500 certifications in the town of Kennebunk. They might be even different types of certification. Someone mentioned the 16-unit house. I don't know the house, so I can't say that that's unreasonable. And the reason I can't is because if it has, 7 bedrooms and 5 bathrooms, is 16 people sleeping in there that big of a deal? I don't think so. So I'm not saying it isn't, but I'm just saying I can't see the full scenario. So I think it would be a case-by-case basis. And some houses, you mentioned, are having big events and weddings. I think certain properties would have to be reviewed in order to get approved for event hosting. So their certification would maybe be different, that they're allowed to host a wedding or a family reunion or whatever, whereas some might just be 2 or 3 friends or 2 couples coming up for the weekend. So I know it's a lot to unpack, and we'll be talking about this again, but I have spent a lot of time thinking about this. I'm young. I think about investing in property and how I can turn it over and rent and make money. But I also spend 100 nights a year in a hotel and probably another 50 in Airbnbs. I've spent nights in 40 states and 12 countries in Airbnbs. So the argument of, well, you don't know who's coming into your house in your community. Well, hotels aren't taking my background check either. So if it's actually almost feels safer going into someone's home because they're allowing you into their home, So there's just a lot of things to think about. And I think that we can find the best of both here to satisfy the people who are trying to make money, keep our community, a safe community, keep our fire department, not overworked and kind of questioning those safety things. And like to Ed's point and George's point, making sure that we put safety first when we decide to move forward with possibly, tracking these Airbnbs. To me, it's not just knowing where they are, but it's knowing what they are. And is there the fire extinguishers and the exit routes and things like that. We just want to maintain the standards of the town that we try to be. And because there's been no headlines of these things doesn't mean that they can't happen. So I'm just wanting to address the elephant in the room and get ahead of it. So when someone said, I think the last thing I'll say is when Susan came on and said, why does the town, or does the town really want to deal with this? To be honest with you, no. Do I think we need to? Probably, because all good things come to an end. And the way I see it is that if we don't get ahead of it and be proactive, then something's going to go wrong and we're going to wish we had something in place. And that can always change.
Thank you, Courtney. Sally, thank you.
Yeah, I think before we add additional regulations, it's good to know both sides and to really have all the good information. And we've talked about a lot of potential problems. My question is, have we had any real issues? Have we had a lot of complaints? Chris and Karen, do you guys know?
I think they said earlier that they have heard that used to be anecdotal, and now they have a tracking system and are beginning to put those together so that, but right now I don't think we have a lot of data to rely on, Sally. That's my.
Okay, so it's just potential problems right now that we're trying to weigh. Okay.
You know, it's you know, reading the zeitgeist of the community, you know, that there's rumblings of discontent when it comes to this issue. And I see, you know, there's a person that I see in the waiting room who I know has some issues with people. You know, George spoke to that. So, I mean, there are residents in this community that have brought this up that have some legitimate concerns. I don't think we've really identified what the problem is tonight. I think we've started down that road, and I've got an idea that I will share in a moment, but first to Lisa, then Shiloh, and then back to Bill.
Thanks, Blake. So I think that, you know, we're trying to identify what the problem is, what's the issue, but obviously so many communities in our country have regulated this. And so it seems like we're playing catch up once again. And I really feel like, what is the issue with at least having short-term rentals register? You know, I don't think that is an issue. Going down the road of only allowing a certain amount or only allowing them in certain neighborhoods is definitely a bigger conversation. But I think having short-term rentals be registered and having the town know about them is an important first step. A bajillion other towns in this country have done that. And I feel like that is something that, you know, it can't hurt. Obviously, it'll bring some revenue that maybe will help pay for that company that Chris said that I can't remember right now, host compliance. And so maybe that will also help pay for somebody who's going to help address the complaints. So that's my issue. I think that that's an important first step for the town. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. Shiloh, and then Bill.
Thanks, Blake. I think this has been a really interesting discussion tonight. I appreciate everybody who came from the public to talk. I think and from everybody from the town staff who came with information and to share. This is it's sort of nice to be talking about an issue that we're not in crisis mode about, right? And so this is something we can actually do right and get ahead of. Clearly, there is concern within the community about this. I could see, given how quickly things can change, that this could become a crisis. This could probably is for some people in the town. I'm probably hearing me and saying, no, it's a crisis for me. And I'm sure it is. But I think it could become more so throughout the community over time. It's, as I think John mentioned, it's hard we didn't really see this coming in some ways. It's hard to predict the future. But I do think we have an opportunity to learn from others. Lisa pointed out there's lots of communities around the country. We heard about South Portland. There's probably a lot of other models to look at as well. I don't think doing nothing and waiting for it to turn into a crisis is a good idea. I know we heard a bunch of possible solutions and sort of brainstorming tonight. Courtney had a bunch of ideas, which I appreciated. But I don't think I don't think we're ready to jump into an ordinance mode yet. I would like to see potential ordinances. I'd like to see what if we did go ahead with a licensing scheme down the road, what would that work plan? Maybe I'm not sure scheme is the right word, but a licensing approach. What that would look like, what's that going to cost us? What's that going to revenue? Like all those kind of things. But bigger to a bigger point, these are all solutions, but what is the end objective? And I think Blake, you alluded to that. We don't really have an end objective to this yet. What would the end objective might be something about, we need to look at the inventory in our town for rental properties, not short-term rentals, but rentals in general. I don't think a short-term rental by definition is taking a long-term rental out of the market, because some of these properties never were rented out long-term. They might have been homes that then somebody's just jump into this model because it's lucrative, and they wouldn't just rent out for a year. So, but there's some of that is clearly happening. We heard about that tonight. And that is a concern, because we've already prior to this said that rental properties are limited, workforce housing is limited, affordable housing is limited in this town. So there are other possible solutions and ways to think about this too, because if market forces are going to act and people are just going to go with, ultimately licensing might just be our step in the road. It won't change the direction of this. It will just mean that we have some control over it, but it's still going to move in that direction. Then maybe we need to think about things like a really joining into part of a York County public transit infrastructure, so people can live in an adjacent town and work in Kennebunk, or live in Kennebunk and work in an adjacent town and move around. Maybe there's other bigger picture pieces of this puzzle that need to be addressed in terms of housing, because that's really what the core issue that we need to be thinking about is, as well as, of course, the safety and neighborhood feel and those kind of things. But I think we need to look at this in the context of how people can either live and or work in town, and what are the solutions to that. So I imagine there'll be at least another workshop, and then probably some ordinance discussion around that.
Thank you, Shiloh. Bill?
Okay, okay. Well, first of all, thank you. And it's been a very interesting discussion. I've learned a lot. Chris, you've told me that we've actually, at the short-term rental thing, which I thought was more of a beach phenomena, and which has always been the case. I mean, people were renting houses by the week when they had vacation weeks, going way back, even before I was born, especially after we lost all the hotels. Just as a point of history, we've lost hundreds of bed space between the Narragansett, the Atlantis, the Sagamore, and a lot of these hotels you'll never even, and the Wentworth and many others that are long gone and were never replaced. Short-term rentals have always filled that void all through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. That's, in any case, getting back to this, in the investment, it wasn't as big a problem. Down on Lord's Point, we had one house that was sort of rented out in the end, and the other house was where the people lived. We saw a few scattered other examples of that down in the beach area. Most of the examples that were rented down there, and George will remember this very well, were houses that were sometimes a family would own, and one part of the family would have 2 weeks, another family would have a week, and so on and so forth. So that was the nature. That's always been the nature of short-term rentals down in the beach area. Now it seems already on Lord's Point, 2 houses were bought that were multi-million-dollar houses that have been converted into Airbnb. And now now we're beginning to see from George and his experience down in the part of the neighborhood he lived in, that you've got some safety issues. The safety one definitely concerns me. That's something that I think we have to somehow find a way to look at. And but I also want to go back to where Shiloh was and where we all were at the beginning of this thing, and further identify the problem. And I think there's actually 2 separate issues here. One is accessible housing, where you could have somebody work at Amato's at $18 an hour and still have a place to put a roof over their head. And that's been a problem for a long while down here in Kennebunk. That's not a new issue here. And I think that's got to be addressed. The issue of house price rises, and especially where the market is boiled over. And we've had houses. I had one real estate agent that told me of a house that sold for $70,000 over asking price, and this wasn't a $1 million house. So there's been a huge demand pull on inflation that's occurred with regard to housing that may have have its roots into the short-term housing market, but there's other aspects. I have a house right next to me down here where I live. That's $100,000 more than it was a year ago. That's a family living in it year round. So the housing price market, I don't think is strictly driven by short-term rentals. But I think that's why I say I think housing is a big issue, but I think it needs to be considered separately of this. In any case, I'm anxious to hear more about the problem. What is the problem that we're trying to fix? Because we eventually, if we're going to build some kind of a solution, which would be the ordinance, we have to know where we're going. I think that DeCharler brought that up, and I've been thinking about that too. we have to have some kind of an idea as to define what we're trying to fix. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Bill.
And I want to
Okay,
hear more about the problem, about the complaints.
thanks, Bill. So I think what we're faced with is a disruptive innovation, and a disruptive innovation is one that creates new markets and new value networks and eventually displaces old products and services. And that's, the best example would be Amazon. Amazon had a huge hit on the bricks and mortar retail business. Uber made a big impact in cabs. I mean, there used to be a huge market in cab medallions in New York City, and now that business has been disrupted by this new innovation called Uber. And we could go down the list of those innovations that have disrupted the world that we knew as we were growing up, the world that we knew even 5 years ago. And so, yes, I agree with Shiloh that we have the luxury of doing this right. But I don't think we have the luxury of sitting idly by and letting this problem build to a place where it gets out of control. Disruptive innovations are uncomfortable, and they're going to be uncomfortable for us, especially this one that has so many people on either side of the issue. And it's going to challenge this board, but I think we're up to that task. In that regard, if I don't know if referring this out to the Ordinance Subcommittee would be a way to go, but it might be a good first step to let the Ordinance Subcommittee take a hack at not just bringing back ordinances, but possible licensing schemas. There's another way of saying it, and other suggestions so that we don't wait for another workshop, that we can continue to advance this in between workshops and actually work on it and bring things forward that would answer some of the questions that have been posed tonight and get us a little further down the road to understanding what the problem is and how we might engage in a solution. So does that make sense to everyone? And I'm just, Bill doesn't, so what do you want us, Bill, what's up?
Okay, sorry. and Blake, I understand your zeal, but what I want to do
Zeal?
is get your zeal to move forward on the issue. So I understand that. What I'd like to do first is, again, to get to define what we're trying to fix, and then move forward with trying to discuss a licensing option, or if that indeed is the best solution to fix the problem, or to discuss what kind of ways the problem can be best solved. But right now,
So Bill, hold on a
to
second.
find the problem.
Bill, we don't have the luxury of kicking the can down the road like that. We need to move this forward, and we can either devote substantial portions of our regular meeting agenda to this, or we can keep doing these workshops. We already have workshops stacked from here to the horizon on very important matters. And so I'm not suggesting that we license, I'm suggesting only that we give some consideration of things that we might bring back to this board so that we can move this forward. I'm not making any other suggestion beyond that. I have no zeal for this at all. Courtney, quickly, please.
I was just going to say, Blake, I mean, everyone just spoke and asked what the problem is. I guess for me, the problem is that there's no plan. And if the number went up just 40, no plan from a town perspective in terms of when this number goes up 40 this year, but really that's not including the real estate agencies. So it's probably closer to 750 or more. What about when that number gets to 1,500 and those complaints turn into 100? Then we don't have a plan. No one is saying that, like, I don't see anyone on here that's like agreeing with either side fully. It seems to me like no one has a huge problem with short-term rentals, but everyone wishes that they are at least safe and at least maybe registered, right? So to me, I think the two problems are that right now they're not registered and we cannot confirm that they're safe. I don't really care if people are making money or they're not. Like, that's not my problem. So I think the problem when we're asking is, right now, we're not getting ahead of it if we just say, okay, this was a good discussion. And then it is on top of us because the numbers outweigh what we can control. If we are going to try and, register these people, right now it's maybe 500 to register. In another year, if we wait, it becomes 1,500. No one is saying restrictions or anything yet, just having a list. I agree with that.
That's all we're saying. Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you, Courtney. Yep. Shiloh.
So I was with Bill on this initially on like, well, I'm not really ready to do that, but I would be interested. I think it would be advance our cause to have maybe the ordinance committee be specifically not necessarily trying to come up with an ordinance,
No.
but to at least review relevant ordinances from other towns, try to identify the common threads that might be relevant to Kennebunk and come back with those. Those ordinances would be in place specifically to address problems. So if we're talking about what are the problems that might be addressed through ordinances, we can see other communities that are similar to ours or comparable to ours, and what their ordinances look like. That could be what we're tasked to do in the ordinance committee, bringing that back to the board and having a more comprehensive assessment of those ordinances and see if those are relevant, and maybe with a recommendation that some might be relevant. But that's only going to be important, only going to matter if it further discussion about what is our end goal. We can't be making an ordinance to solve a problem that we haven't defined. So
Yeah,
I think we look at the ordinances and come back to the board.
Yeah, my suggestion was simply that the ordinance subcommittee would review and bring back to the committee proposed ways of addressing this issue. But in my view, we have just jumped into the middle of a mud puddle tonight, and gotten dirty in the process. Yes, we've had a fulsome conversation about the issues, but we haven't really driven to the point where we have identified what is the problem and is it really our problem to solve? I think that's the issue that ultimately needs to be addressed.
So
we've touched on it, but we haven't really.
Well, I think the challenge is that it's not the problem. There are multiple aspects of this that are maybe require different solutions. And so,
Yeah,
there's a safety issue. There's the housing inventory issue. There's the affordable housing. There's lots of pieces of this that come together. But we may be able to solve, or at least minimize the safety issue of having excess people in a house. That doesn't solve the other problems, which are related to some things like John brought up about affordable housing and inventory, or rental properties, long-term rental properties, and how they're influenced. Those things we might need to identify as either not our problem or requiring a different solution. But I think what we need to establish is understand is that it's not a problem. There's multiple, and each of those are going to require potentially a different solution rather than a single solution that solves everything.
Yep. I'm just trying to make a suggestion of how to move this thing forward. I mean,
and what I'm saying is I agree with it, but I think we need to recognize it's not going to we can.
So here's the issue, Shiloh. We can't dump this on the town staff. That's not an option here. We're going to have to step up and do some of this work on our own. And in that regard, I think, we have a subcommittee. We could form a task force if that's your preference. But going from one workshop to another is not a viable way forward, in my view. Devoting significant amount of time in each of our meeting agendas is not likely to get us there any faster. So that's why I'm suggesting that we farm this out to a smaller group that is meeting in public, notice to the public, and try to come up with some ideas of what the problems are and what the possible solutions might be.
I have a few more things to say, but I'm going to step down because Lisa has her hand up.
Go ahead, Lisa.
I just wanted to say that I agree with you, Blake. I think that that's a good place to start because we can't keep having workshops and just discussing it and not making decisions. I think we need to move this forward and make some sort of decision. So I think that having the ordinance subcommittee is a good first step. The other thing is, I just want to get ahead of things. I don't want there to have to be a problem that we have to solve. Maybe we just solve something, do something before there's a problem. And I think that that's sort of the mindset we need to have. Instead of what's the problem, we need to solve it. Let's just do something and, you know, set the standard and avoid the problems to begin with.
I'm sorry, that doesn't make any sense to me at all, Lisa. You know, you have to, you know, if you don't have an identified, you know, and call it whatever you want, issue, problem, I mean, come up with your own word, but just doing something is not an effective way of running this town. That's not effective.
Other towns have created, you know, have created registrations or ordinances behind these short-term rentals. We're not the first to do it. So it's not like it's a whole new concept. Like there doesn't have to be a problem behind it, but obviously other towns have seen that there's a reason to do this. So that's what I'm just saying. And you know, there shouldn't have to be a problem to create a answer.
So the Nike solution, just do it, doesn't work in a town government. Go ahead, Shiloh.
Yeah, so I think you're arguing past each other because the Lisa was agreeing with you, Blake, on the approach, and I think the bigger point, and maybe I don't want to correct me if I'm wrong, Lisa, but Blake, one of the things you've said, and I 100% agree with, is that we don't want to be in a situation of putting out fires. We want to be thinking strategically and getting ahead of issues before they become problems. And I thought that's what Lisa was just saying, was that it's not so much just like randomly do something for the sake of doing it. I don't think that's what Lisa was saying. I think we need to be.
That's what it sounded like to me.
Okay, that's not how it sounded to me, but I don't want to speak for you, Lisa. So I want to step back.
No,
but the only thing I wanted to finish my thought before, which was to say that I think we need. I'm fine with going ahead. I think the idea of a smaller group, like digging deeper into this and spending hours outside of these meetings on really understanding the challenges and the different parts of these and what are the challenges that we're going to have to solve, which things maybe are outside our purview, and coming back with some recommendations to the board is a great idea. The ordinance subcommittee doesn't necessarily have that mandate. At least not fully. It's a place to start. And if we want to expand it to include that, I'm fine with that. If we want to create a separate task force that's involved with the several of us on the board, I'm okay with that too. That kind of worked for the transfer station, but that was a lot of town staff that did most of that work. So we do have to think about that as well. And eventually we will have to go back and work with town staff on this, regardless of how we go about it, because they have a lot of knowledge. So I think we need to get on this. I think we need to take the lead on it. And if we want to start with ordinance, that's fine. Just recognize that the mandate for that may need to expand or shift over time.
Let's do it.
Thank you, Shiloh. Courtney?
Yeah, Lisa, that's literally what I said when I last had my hand up, that I just feel like, you know, it does not need to be a defined problem, just in the fact that, like you said, Blake, this is just something new that is here. And if we let it outgrow what we can control, then it's too late. And whatever we do is reactive to that and solving a problem that becomes one. Right now, I don't think just having, like you say, I don't want to kick the can down the road. I think it's very clear and very neutral to just say, if you have an Airbnb or you have a short-term rental, it needs to be registered, period. Whether that's a fee or it isn't, I don't even care. I'd rather a fee so we can make some money, but regardless, we should have a list of what is available in the town. And people should be able to, we should be able to maintain that. And I also think that, you know, having a simple safety requirement list, that they have to have fire extinguishers at the very least, that they have to have blah, blah, blah at the very least. Going down the whole path like Kennebunkport just did, giving very defined things, is just not where I think we are at. That's just my opinion. But I agree with Lisa. We just have to take this step. And there doesn't need to be a problem beyond what you said, Blake, which is that it exists. Airbnb exists, short-term rentals exist. That is our problem, as is defined. And we don't have it's existing and we don't have a grasp on it. That is the problem if I'm sitting here listening to this. And I think as soon as we open it up to the ordinance, which you said, the ordinance committee, and it is public and posted, you're going to get just a larger volume of what we heard tonight. I think we heard very amicable sides of both of this. I totally see both sides of it. I have from the beginning. I think you're just going to have raves of 50 and 50. And the reality is, if we can come down the middle and say, hey, you can do this if you have it, by the rules. It's like having a car, you have to register it. Carrying a weapon, you have to register it. Doing this, you have to, you know what I mean? Sure,
Yeah.
you can have your short-term rental. We just have to.
So we're about to go into the budget process, and you're just assuming that there's excess capacity for the fire department to go out and do these inspections, or you're assuming that that there is capacity in the code enforcement office. You're assuming that we can register these without adding any additional staff or time. I mean, all of this has impact, and all of this costs money. And
Just to be clear, I'm not assuming that by any means, because the number one thing on my list was the fire department. So I totally get it. I think that, yes, we are going into budget season. So that to me is another important thing, that if we are going to move this forward, where you're going to want to put someone in the budget to handle this, now's the time. But also doing simply a registration and simply handing out at least a list of requested or recommended guidelines as a starting place is just a place to start. No one is saying that we have to. Do you know what I mean? Like,
well, yeah, but it's you use the word simple, and I don't think this is simple. I don't,
the broader issue of it is not at all simple. You're right, Blake. You're absolutely right. It's not at all simple. But my point is that no one is saying that the full final plan has to be tomorrow. Any progress forward is better than having nothing.
Well, not necessarily. And so I'm looking to Mike, and Mike, if we were to register these properties, what would that take? Just wild ass guess in terms of staff.
Blake, I can't offer that with any precision whatsoever. What I do see is, and I thank you for stepping in the mud puddle, all of you, because these are things that we're trying to be very proactive on. I do think it goes back to a little bit of what Karen touched on about a philosophical approach by the board. And so what is going to be your philosophy on how to advance forward this topic, and taking some pragmatic steps, laying those out. Natalie left us with the idea of some sample ordinances to give you an idea of certain components that you may or may not wish to embrace. I think taking those steps, and Blake, I can't give you an answer on what it would take, but we know it would take resources. And we know that those resources we currently have can't meet that demand. So it would be an additional person or more. But if we tie a fee to that, then there's cost offsets to that. What that formula would look like, I can't offer off the cuff.
Understood. Anybody else? Courtney?
Just one last thing. So after hearing from Mike, I guess for me, Blake, it's simply, I agree with going to the ordinance committee and having them maybe discuss it, or maybe they could be the ones to take Natalie's, current examples and maybe pick from it what meets our town's needs and their opinion. I agree that an ordinance is not a one-time or one size fits all. Like, we are not going to have the same rules as Old Orchard Beach and Portland, totally different demographics, different zoning, blah, 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 blah. If ordinance maybe takes those examples from Natalie and comes up with what they think are the main bullet points, we all have copies and are able to go through it. We put an agenda item on the meeting, and we, make it one meeting, minimal. And in my opinion, I know I'm making it sound so simplified, but I guess in my mind, it's that we've had nothing. So even if it was to a vote in June that says, does the town agree to register and require safety measures for short-term rentals, and that is simply the vote, what does that leave on us? It's up to the town. If no one thinks it's that big of a problem, then this is washed again for 3 more years. That's all I'm saying. And I think that is realistic by June, to at least have that on the vote or not. Nothing to do with town hall other than what we would like safety measures to be and a registration form. I'm in support of Airbnbs. We've talked about this, but I also see the other side. So I just want to make sure we are doing as much as we can so we don't have to deal with the issues.
Okay, so so that we have some action step here, does the board believe that it would be a good next step to refer this to the ordinance subcommittee, regardless of mandate? I hear what you're saying, Shiloh, but I don't know that we have a mandate anyway, that I'm aware of. Or would you rather form a task force? I guess that's really what we're talking about. Shiloh?
I'm okay with, personally, with having this go to ordinance with the idea that it's not necessarily the creation of a new ordinance at this point. It's coming back with the relevant pieces of ordinances, informing our discussion, our next discussion, with more in-depth analysis of what other towns have done with ordinances and what elements might be relevant to our community, pending the final or pending an additional setting of goals for our community around this issue.
Mike?
If I might, a couple of weeks ago, I believe, and you may look back, some of you may have seen it, others might not have had the opportunity. I think I sent 3 or 4 different ordinances out to you to include Falmouth, South Portland, Kennebunkport, and one other, I believe. And so those may serve as a foundation resource for you to consider. And so you can perhaps maybe cherry pick certain components of those that you find would be helpful. And maybe that's something the ordinance subcommittee could look at, decide which ones they would recommend to bring back to the full board for further consideration.
Yeah, and I saw those, Mike, and that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about, and along with what Natalie brought up tonight. But I guess where I was going with the mandate issue comment before was that by definition, that subcommittee would have to think through some of the bigger issues around short-term rentals and which pieces that we would recommend that we take on, and what specific issues they would address, whether it's safety or whether it's inventory or whether there are other things. That would be initially thought through by that subcommittee, referred back to the full board, and we can have another discussion. I'm okay with that approach as long as we understand what it is.
Yes. Yes.
Bill?
Did you want to have at least, if you're gonna have the ordinance committee look at ordinances, do you want to at least have a task force to look at what the problem is, to define what we're trying to fix?
No. I mean, I'm just responding to your question. I mean,
Like, I mean, I'm not trying to be critical. I
no, I
know.
I'm just responding,
Blake, I also think if we are looking for what the problem is, we might end up creating a problem. Clearly, there's not enough people on here, right? No, I'm don't take that the wrong way. I see your eyes. I'm saying, like, if we dig deeper and have this big task force for all these things that don't even exist, we don't need to recreate the wheel here. Like Mike just said, he sent us 3 ordinances. I looked through, I think it was 4. I think the other one was York, Mike. I looked through them. I've looked at towns in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire that kind of align with who we are as a town. As I said, this is something that my age group is looking at because A, we use these things, and B, people want to invest to have them. So I see both sides, and I want to come out with a very commonality to make it work for both. So I think that the more time we spend on it with a task force and a committee and all these things, we are overlooking the 2 things that Karen, Lisa, and Shiloh all addressed, as is myself, about the other issues we have at hand, which is our housing market, our affordable housing, things we should be putting that time and energy into in our meetings. This does not need to be rocket science. I'm not saying that it needs to stay where it will be, but at least something to show that we made the effort as a board to show that we care about the people like George, but that we see the sides of Kathy and Susan, and just kind of go from there. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you, Courtney. Shiloh?
So I just wanted to respond to Bill in that, as I said earlier, one of the things that we would have to do in the ordinance committee is to think through specifically what would be the reason for having an ordinance, what issue would it be addressing, and what problem would it be solving. And those have to be focused, and they have to have a reason for being, and they have to be enforceable, and they have to have some concept behind them. So that probably is a reasonable place to start, at least to think through those starting issues and start to frame what might solve at least one of the pieces. As I said, there's more than one problem, but there's more than one aspect to this issue. And so we could at least define what we're talking about and take a slice of it and bring that back before the board. And I would suggest that come to those meetings, be on that committee or be part of those discussions, and move it forward.
Yeah, my only point is this, that if we don't, yes, there are multiple problems, not denying that. In fact, I started the meeting by listing all of them, and not all of them, at least some of them. How will we know which ordinance or licensing schema to use if we don't understand what the problem is that we're trying to solve? And I think that's what you were just saying, right, Shiloh? All right, Mike.
I'm sorry to prolong. I think Natalie and Sally Daggett may be a huge asset to the board, as they can cite what was the foundation for the creation of ordinances in other communities. And they may be able to share with the board, here's what prompted South Portland, Falmouth, et cetera, to create an ordinance. And those may be problems that we detect here, or that we're not aware of, or that don't exist. And that may be kind of the impetus for us to move forward.
I mean, if we don't have any data to start on, I mean, we haven't heard any complaints, or those complaints haven't been logged yet. It does beg the question, why did we just spend 2 hours and 15 minutes talking about this issue?
We have had one very large complaint in our community, and others that we're hearing a bit of. My greatest concern is that we remain stagnant, and I say we, meaning the board as the policymakers, that we remain stagnant, and then we're caught by surprise, and potentially, Blake, in your PowerPoint, you recommend, or you identified the fact that that may open criticism for all of us. And so the proactive approach, I appreciate.
Okay, so I'll send you everybody my PowerPoint, which I'm hoping you'll add to or subtract from, but it might be a good starting point, a good working document for us to start the process of collecting our thoughts on this. Courtney, we're trying, the plane is running on fuel here.
I'm good. I keep going to mute saying, this is it. The last thing I was going to say is, like, I look at it like the fireworks though, Blake, right? There was a subcommittee for that, and now you have to provide a map in order to get that permit. And that was because of what? What was the problem? The problem was not just houses possibly being burned down by an ember, never mind with 16 people in it, but because neighbors were upset. And the calls were off the hook and police were having to go. So if there's party houses, that happens at hotels, it happens at short-term rentals, it happens wherever. Hotels are businesses. They are having to, have security or employees that are watching over those things. Neighbors like George shouldn't have to be going around being the police or calling our police and taking them away. Just like I'm a season ticket holder for the Buccaneers. If people misuse my seats, I lose my seats. So I guess I sort of see it as, you can do your thing, but we just have to have it in play. It's just like the fireworks. It is literally to a T what you're describing. What is the problem? Well, I don't see any problem with light in the sky or loud booms, but people do. I don't see a problem with 5 parked cars if they all fit in my driveway. Why are you worried about what's in my driveway, right? However, people are worried because that's what people do. So that might mean there's 18 people in the house, or, you have to just, that is the problem, is that it is clearly existing and we just have to get ahead of it.
Thank you, Courtney. Lisa, I know you had your hand up. No? Okay.
Moving.
Sally?
No,
Okay.
I'm about ready to pass out.
Yeah, I hear you. Copy that. So we're going to go to the Ordinance Subcommittee, which is where we took fireworks, and understand that we're using the term ordinance in a broader sense than what it has meant in the past. Or we can go to a task force, if you're uncomfortable with that, Shiloh. I just think that's how we
I guess, like I said, I'm fine with starting there. If it turns out to be a bigger issue and beyond our purview, then we might need to.
Okay, good. So that's what we've agreed to that then. All thumbs up. And Bill, you're on the Ordinance Subcommittee, so,
Am I? I didn't know it was.
Yeah, you are.
Blake, since this is the first thing
sure.
we've sent, we haven't sent anything else, I don't think, since Sally, Lisa, and I started. So they're not making any decisions, right? This is just people doing what we basically in town hall don't have the time to dig into the nitty gritty. Their committee is to go through, like we said, am I getting that right?
We come back with recommendations to the full
Yeah.
board.
We're not
Okay.
making, yeah, we can't conduct business. We don't take votes. We don't, we basically meet and confer and
Okay.
we make recommendations, as Shiloh said.
But we don't have to
Yeah.
agree with anything they say, is that right? I guess I'm a little
The
confused
final
about.
decisions are all from the full board.
Yeah.
Okay, I was only concerned because Shiloh, usually I'm like, kind of follow wherever you're at, and I seeing your hesitancy is, I'm confused by it.
The only reason I'm hesitant about this at all is not that, I think it's not an ordinance issue necessarily, but I think that we have a fairly well-defined, there's complaints about fireworks, therefore there needs to be maybe a look at the fireworks ordinance and change it. And
Right.
we don't have an ordinance around this, and we haven't clearly, I felt, gotten to the
Okay.
point where everybody was in general agreement where we're going. So we're gonna have to do some exploring and some digging on this within the ordinance committee, and then get to the point of potentially crafting either ordinance language or some recommendations that we come back to the board with. So it's a bit more amorphous than we normally would see going into ordinance, but
And remember, and also coordinate, if I may, when we started the fireworks ordinance discussions, we had had a board presentation by somebody that was complaining about the fact that their house was almost burned down. So they were getting hot cinders on their roof, and that the house met the original standard. So that there was.
Understood, thank you, Bill.
I'm going to ask Chris Ostreiter, are there ordinances that cover this, to your knowledge, short-term rentals, or I think you mentioned that one of our zoning.
Well, I think this is what's tricky is our ordinances do regulate housing and types of housing and rentings of room. But when you get into that 30-day window, that's where there's a distinction. Ours do not. When we get into that level of it, we do have lodging, which we license, which is not covered in the land use ordinance, and that's handled separately. So what happens externally, I can't answer that. How we handle it internally, many of the zones, I think it was changed last in suburban res to allow the increasing number of renting of rooms. And then, so we do have different provisions of how to handle this, but not in the traditional way of short-term rental. That type of transient nature is really unaddressed.
Okay, so we've decided that we're going to refer this to the Ordinance Subcommittee, and so let it be written, so let it be done. Is that okay with everyone?
Yes. Yes,
That work?
thumbs up.
Yeah, thumbs up. Yep. All right. So anything else before we go quietly into that good night? Yes, Frank, you have your hand up? No, okay. Before Sally passes out, we will all say good night and thank you for a wonderful conversation. Obviously, I didn't get my nap this afternoon, so I'm cranky. So
You're looking
I
hangry,
was
Blake.
gonna send you over something, but
yeah.
all right, right there with you, Sally. I'm ready to go.
All right. Bye, everyone.
All right.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.